Welcome to Module 6, the final module for this course on vital skills for implementing and managing conservation projects. In this module, you'll learn about how to use your conservation standards plan to set up a structure for reporting and monitoring. This step's often overlooked, but you've invested a lot of time in your planning, and at this point you want to have the systems in place that will support your implementation and your reporting. In this module, you'll explore some potential systems for data storage, and you'll learn about what you should be considering as you choose a system that will meet your needs, context, and resources. Finally, you will learn about how to handle new information that you learn in the course of implementing your project. By the end of this module, you'll be able to demonstrate the following skills or competencies. You'll be able to clarify the types of information you need to store and manage as you track your project. You'll be able to identify potential data entry and storage systems to help you manage and later use the information you will track. You'll also be able to list and understand the minimum requirements for each system. You'll be able to identify the benefits and limitations of each system. And finally, you'll be able to select the system that is best suited for your work and context. Again, as a reminder, this is the whole conservation standards cycle. And remember, we're at step 3 of the conservation standards. More specifically, we're at the point of implementing our conservation plans. Our main emphasis in this module is on establishing practices and setting up good systems for managing your data. So let's do a little bit of a review. In previous modules, you learned how to use your conservation standards plan to develop a high-level work plan and budget, and how to make tough decisions to bring your work plan and budget into line with your likely funding. And in the last module, you learned about key principles and practices for engaging donors and securing funding for your project. So at this point, you have your project all planned, you have your priorities set, and you've got some money to get you going. Now it's time to get soaring, right? Well, yes and no. It is time to get your project underway, but part of that is making sure you have the systems in place to track how things are going and to allow for course correction. Thinking back to your road trip, you wouldn't want to jump in your car and go if you didn't have a speedometer or a fuel gauge or any of the warning systems that tell you when you have a problem. Sure, you don't need them to start your journey, but you do need them once you're on your journey, and you definitely don't want to build them as you go along. You also want to start your trip feeling prepared for the unexpected. What happens if a road is closed or if there's a flood? Maybe there's a better path than the one you're on, a path that's cheaper or gets you to your destination more quickly. In this case, a map would be helpful, or maybe a phone can help identify other transportation options. We aren't always certain about the path we are on, so it's important to have the systems, whether they're maps, gauges, alert systems, in place that allow us to monitor and determine when we need to adjust course. Or, if we want a nature analogy, if you're a condor taking off for flight, you want to make sure all your sensory systems are working properly. So, what systems do you really need? The specifics around what you need depend partially on the aims and resources of your project and what your monitoring audiences want and need to know. However, there are some basic components for all projects that you should consider. You should make sure you are tracking progress on implementing your project, progress on achieving results, and changes in information available to you. So let's talk a bit more about what we mean by each of these. So it might help to look at these different elements schematically. Over the course of your project, you should be recording data about progress on implementing your project. Are you doing what you said you would do? Are there any delays or changes? What's behind those? Progress on achieving results. Are you seeing the results that you expected to see? In particular, the changes you identified in your results chains, and also in the goals and objectives you set. What might be influencing their achievement or lack thereof? Changes in information available to you. Have you learned anything new since the start of your project that might influence your actions or their potential success? Has anything changed in your context? This new information may come from passive observation. Maybe it's just something you heard or read about, or it could be something that you have actively pursued. You may have conducted or commissioned a study to gather new data or synthesize existing data, or maybe you talked to an expert or looked up something on a reputable website. All of these contribute to strengthening your knowledge around your project, so you need systems in place to track these elements, and gauges or dashboards to provide you with timely information so that you can correct your course as you go along your journey. And as you learn, you will need to revisit your situation analysis, portrayed in your situation model, and your strategies and theories of change, portrayed in your results chains, to make updates as needed. We'll take each of these elements and walk through them. But first, let's talk about some high-level good practices you should be considering when selecting your systems. First, you want to be clear about why you are collecting monitoring data, what decisions you want to make, and who can make them. You should have had these conversations with your team as part of Step 2 of the conservation standards when you were developing your monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan. You should consider a range of systems. In this presentation, we'll share just a few options, but there are lots of others out there. It could be helpful to talk with colleagues within your organization or at partner organizations if the systems that we discuss here won't work for you. When considering this range, it's useful to lay out and compare the pros and cons of each system. But the decision shouldn't happen just within your team. You'll want to consult with staff in other departments. For example, you may need to talk to your administrative, financial, and M&E staff to make sure your system is compatible with their systems. You may find that you need different systems for your raw data versus summary data. And you should also consider your reporting needs and how you want to present data to your key audiences. For example, do you need graphs, charts, images? Can your system generate them? Or can your system export the data that will allow you to generate them? This may require working with your communications and IT staff. You should choose a system that fits within your budget. And even once you think you have your system identified, it's a good idea to test it, either with a small set of real data or even fictitious data. Finally, setting up your system for tracking project progress is an important step, but as with many good practices in the conservation standards, you should not let this get away from you. Any system you choose will have pros and cons, so just take a step back and ask whether this is the system that will help you and your team with decision making. And remember, you can always tweak your systems over time if needed. So let's go back to this graphic as a reminder about the different systems you'll need, including systems to track progress on implementing strategies, progress toward achieving results, and any new information that you may collect. We'll talk about the requirements and some example systems for each of these in the following slides. Let's start with implementation progress. When choosing any system, you'll need to figure out what works best for your team, organization, and context. But even so, there are some basic requirements that a system should have for adequately tracking implementation. Here are some. You'll need status fields for both strategies and activities, so you have a space to formally track progress on them. You want a date field that will be useful for sorting reports by dates and comparing reports over time. Comments, so that you can add any clarifying notes. You also want to be able to sort and filter. This will allow you, for example, to group your activities under your strategies or to find any strategies or activities that may be experiencing problems. A system should also allow you to restrict or open access to others as needed. So maybe some people have viewing access while others have editing or commenting rights. Ideally, you should have access to previous data so that you can easily see how things have changed over time. And also, ideally, your system should be able to communicate with and/or import/export data from other systems. So let's look at some potential systems. We'll share a few common options that meet the minimum requirements outlined here. But again, keep in mind, there's a whole universe of systems. And so you and your team are going to have to decide on what will work for you. But just keep in mind, be sure to consider these minimum requirements when choosing a system. The Miradi software you've been using offers one potential system for tracking implementation. You can do this using the desktop version of Miradi or the online editing capabilities. First, let's look at the desktop version. Miradi uses color-coded categories to allow users to specify how they are doing on implementing their strategies and activities. Here you can see a bunch of different options. So we can see here this activity has been completed, and here you can see some details from the last progress report and from an earlier progress report. The comments field in particular is an important field for all types of reporting that you will be doing. So here we can see a table that summarizes the implementation progress entries, and we can also see that information in a diagrammatic view. Which view you choose to use will likely depend on with whom you're working and how they like to see information. This ability to see your data in diagrammatic and tabular form is a feature unique to Miradi systems. If you prefer, you can also do the updates directly online via Miradi Share and see lots of information at a glance. This is the same information from prior screenshots, just a different view and way of entering and interacting with the data. Another familiar option for tracking implementation progress is a spreadsheet. You could recreate something that looks like what you might see in Miradi as shown here, or you could create a spreadsheet that's tailored to your own preference. The advantage of spreadsheets is that you can custom design them as you see fit. The drawback, though, is that you may have project data stored in multiple places. For example, maybe you do your planning in Miradi but move your tracking to Google Spreadsheets. Any changes you do in one place would then have to be manually replicated in the other systems. So you should consider these implications when you're choosing a system. If you do use spreadsheets, there are some tips to consider. For example, you may want to use conditional formatting to color code cells so that you can get a quick sense of ratings. You also might want to use a pick list to standardize options for some fields. Also, keep in mind that online spreadsheets like Google Spreadsheets or Excel Online offer the added advantage of synchronous editing, so multiple team members could be working on the same progress update simultaneously. Also, Google Spreadsheets has the added advantage of allowing you to name and save versions. So spreadsheets will be as sophisticated as you choose to make them. You can have various fields, you can use filtering and sorting functions, control access, and you can technically access previous data, but the interface might be a bit clunky. For those who are really good at spreadsheets, you can set one up so that it can perform many, though not all of the functions of a relational database. Another option for tracking implementation is to use one of the many types of work tracking systems out there. This example is from Asana. You can see the layout and interface are different from the previous two systems, but the information is all there. In Asana, you can define your categories for progress. So we set up a custom set of categories right here that corresponds to some of the same categories used by Miradi. Your team has the flexibility to define your categories however it works for you. So whichever system you choose, you should think about how you will analyze and use your data in later steps. While you may not be able to anticipate all needs, it's a good idea to give this as much thought as possible so that you set your storage and management systems up in a way that it meets your current and future needs. So let's go back to this spreadsheet as an example. At first glance, this seems like an adequate system, but on closer look, you may notice that you have three different types of elements in column A: the high-level strategy, the more specific strategy, and the activities associated with them. And if you wanted to look just at progress on strategies, for example, with this table, you couldn't really do it. It's not set up to allow that. Or let's say you did some alphabetical sorting, you would lose the nested nature of the table. So you could do a couple of things here. You could create ID codes that will ensure that like items are sorted together. And you could also create another column that will allow you to filter by the type of item in the row. There are other ways to organize the spreadsheet too, so it would be more searchable and function a bit more like a database. These are just a couple of examples. Again, we do want to stress the importance of thinking about your likely future needs now. It's much easier to tweak the system before you enter a bunch of data. At the same time, though, we also want to encourage you to not be afraid to modify your system over time. So returning to our graphic about the different systems you will need, we just talked about systems for recording progress on implementing strategies and activities. Now let's look at systems for storing information related to progress toward achieving expected results. First, let's look at some minimum requirements again. There's a lot of overlap with what we saw in the implementation requirements. So your system should have a clear place where you can record progress on your goals and objectives, as well as any associated indicators. As you know, not all results have objectives, so it can also be useful to track the status of your results. If you wish to track and compare progress over time, it'll be important for your system to provide you access to previous data and reports in an efficient manner. And of course, on a related note, you'll want to make sure your system has a date field. You should also be able to restrict or open access to others as needed. And you want a place where you can store notes that will help you and others recall the rationale behind your progress ratings. Finally, your system should ideally be able to communicate with and/or import and export data from other project systems. So let's look at just a few examples again of systems that meet these requirements. Miradi, again, is one potential system for tracking results, including goals and objectives. So you can do this in Miradi or desktop or the online editing capabilities available through Miradi Share. Let's first look at the desktop version, and let's also first focus on tracking results. Later, we'll talk about tracking goals and objectives. Here you can see the color-coded categories to allow users to specify progress on a result. Miradi will show the rating on the result itself, and if you go deeper, you can see you have a space to enter the date and provide notes to clarify the progress rating. Within Miradi, you have the option of viewing the progress results in a tabular form and on your results chains. Different people may like to see these reports in different formats, so it's nice and unique that Miradi offers that feature. If you prefer, you can do updates directly online via Miradi Share. So this is the same information from previous screenshots, just a different view and way of entering and interacting with the data. Note here that you can also see previous reports in addition to the most current report. In our list of minimum requirements, we identified the ability to report on results, which is what we have seen until now. Our list also mentioned the ability to report on goals and objectives. In Miradi, you can track progress toward your goals and objectives as a percentage of a goal or objective that has been achieved. Let's continue to look at this in Miradi Share Online. You can see here that we have highlighted the result of interest in blue, which gives us the options to attach updates related to that result. So if we move to the nested lines below that, we have space to enter data related to the objective, which Miradi records as a percentage of your objective achieved. And we also have space for the indicator attached to that objective. Here you can see that Miradi allows you to enter measurement data, as well as desired future status data, and even provides the ability to create charts for that data. In this chart, you can see the measurement data for 2017, as well as previous years. And you can also see over here that Miradi shows the desired future status in blue. Miradi Desktop also allows you to record this data, though in a different set of views. Again, spreadsheets offer another way to track your progress toward results, objectives, and indicators. Here we see only results progress, but you can imagine a similar spreadsheet that would track progress toward goals and objectives and even include indicator data. Here you can also see how an online work planning system like Asana could track results, objectives, and goals. You might even want to customize the setup so that you can see implementation progress as well as the results progress side by side, as we've done here. Or perhaps you want to customize it in a different way. Depending on the system you choose, there may be a lot of flexibility to create the views that your team finds most useful. So let's take a moment to talk about raw data. Until now, we've been looking at how systems can store and manage what are likely aggregated data from several measurements. However, you also need some place to store your raw data so that you can use it and aggregate or process it. In many systems, you may find that you need to store your raw data in one place and report your roll-up data in your system. So for example, you could use Miradi to report on an indicator on an annual basis, but it's likely that you'll store your raw data in another system. So perhaps you'll use Spreadsheets, a database or statistical software to store and process the raw data. The tracking and reporting system you use might be able to pull that data through custom programming, or you may need to manually port over the summary data. As we talked about earlier when looking at systems for tracking implementation progress, you should think about how you will analyze and use your data in later steps. Looking at a spreadsheet example again, if you look closely, you will see that this table here mixes three different types of elements in column A: a high-level strategy, a goal, and a few different objectives. If you wanted to look at just progress on objectives, this table doesn't allow you to do that without some manual manipulation that could even lead to losing some data. Or if you did some alphabetical sorting, you would lose the nested nature of the table. So just as before, you could do a couple of things here. You could create ID codes that will ensure that like items sort together, and you could also create another column that will allow you to filter by strategy, goal, and/or objective. So to the degree that you can anticipate data analysis and manipulation needs as you're choosing and building your systems, you'll be in a better position to start using your system for managing and analyzing your data. Returning to our graphic, we're now ready to talk about options for handling new information you may gather in the course of implementing your project, whether you are actively pursuing that information or you happen to observe or hear about something you didn't know earlier. Let's talk about some good practices for new information. In most cases, you should process or record your new information as you get it. More likely than not, you're not going to be getting that information at the time that conveniently coincides with the timing for reviewing project progress, but you don't want to forget this new information either. So you could either update your situation model, results chain, or other components to reflect that new information, or you could keep a change log to remind you of the key changes you need to make. Regardless of which option you use, you should record the sources for your new information and any updates you make to your overall strategic plan. You will want to come back to these during your progress review sessions. So if you're using Miradi, you could just add or remove or revise factors in your diagrams to reflect the new information you've gathered. For example, maybe you've discovered a new threat on the horizon that was not there the last time you worked on your situation model. There's no need to wait to document that new threat. You could just add it to your model when you learn about it. You may find it helpful, though, to use some sort of annotation like this asterisk to remind yourself of any new information you add between reviews. Or perhaps you had an uncertainty in your model, as noted here by the dotted line and the text associated with that dotted line. So you recognize the need to pursue information to help you address that uncertainty. You can see here the results of the information that you gathered that helped your team remove the uncertainty. Just to clarify, you may have gathered that information through a literature search, a phone call to an expert, or even actual field research. Regardless of how you collected it, you could update your diagrams as soon as you have the information. You can see down here that the diagram is now updated, the line is solid rather than dotted, and the text associated with the arrow is right here, recorded in the new information area. Again, it's helpful to use some type of notation to remember this update when it comes time to do your more formal review. Another system or tool that is helpful is a change log. You might find these useful to either track changes you have already made between reviews or to track changes you need to make at the time of your next review. In this example, you can see some fields that are useful to include to keep a solid record of what you have done, when, and why. The main thing is you do not want to forget what you need to update, so you need some system that tracks that and provides enough detail for you or anyone on your team to understand the changes needed or already made and the rationale behind them. So let's wrap up this module by revisiting what we have covered. We started off with some high-level good practices, including clarifying the decisions you want to make, identifying a range of systems, understanding their pros and cons, making sure they work with other systems within your organization and that they fit your overall project scope and budget. We also talked about testing your systems before widely implementing them, and of course, being careful not to get bogged down in the details. Then we talked about different systems for tracking how you are doing on implementing your strategies and activities. We looked at systems to track results and associated goals and objectives. Finally, we talked about new information you might gather as you're implementing your project and some good practices for updating your plans and recording changes needed or already made. All of these contribute to and improve your team's knowledge about your project and context and should be reflected in updates to your situation model, theories of change, and overall strategic plan. And with this, we conclude this training course for vital skills on implementing and managing conservation projects. A big congratulations! You have been on a long journey from reviewing key strategic plan elements from earlier steps of the conservation standards to using your strategic plan to develop high-level work plans and budgets, to making further prioritizations and tough choices, to then understanding how to take those planned products and craft proposals that speak to your donors' interests. And now, last but not least, setting up the systems that will help you track progress. With all this in place, you should be ready to move to step 4 of the conservation standards, analyze and adapt. Thank you so much for joining this course. We welcome any feedback you might have to improve it and suggest that you include that in your course evaluation.